we should start. It's official. Good evening. Thank you for coming. Good evening. It's an evening event, so you can talk back. You've had a beer, you've had a glass of wine. I'm Ed Davis. I'm the Research Director here at the Centre for Social Justice. You won't be hearing a great deal from me. I'm mostly here for timekeeping and sharing purposes. A couple of bits of housekeeping to start with. If you need the toilets, they are out that way and round the left, follow it. If you hear a fire alarm, it's real. Run screaming from that door or that door. In terms of batting order, I'll come to that in a moment, but I want to do a few thank yous first. So thank you all for coming. We are streaming online. Is that now up and running? Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Harry. So mind your language. Hi, Mum. Thank you for all coming. This is a really important issue for us. I'm going to get into a bit of why in a minute. But I also want a massive thank you to the guys from True. That's Paul. Paul, give us a wave. We met with True about a bit over a year ago, and we were talking about partnering with them with some work. And we brought them a lot of the stuff that would be a bit sexy and get a lot of media. And they said, no, bring us something that's hard. Bring us something that's going to take a long time to change, that is difficult to do, because that's what we're in the business of. And I wish I could say that for all our partners, but I can absolutely say that for the guys at True, which has been an absolute pleasure to work with you. So thank you for that. They've held us to account on a big, difficult subject, which is why we're here this evening. And on that, sometimes we have events here where we get the ministers to come and say a few fairly benign words, and then we answer some questions fairly benignly. I don't want that to be this event. This is a really difficult subject, something that we don't think we're getting right, and that does need the brain's trust. And you're here because you're interested in this, and you want to make a difference. I want our panellists and you to challenge each other on our thinking, on where we go next on this, because if we're going to make it better, it demands that of all of us. So quickly on to the panellists. So we have a very high-grade list of panellists here. They feel like a joke in here somewhere. Sort of 2 knights, a professor and a head teacher walk into a think tank. Insert your own conclusion. And starting here to my left, so Kevan Collins. So Kevan Collins is a NED at the DFE. When I was in the Department for Health, someone was introduced me as a NED. I thought that was a Glaswegian term for sort of a scally or a cham.
That's about right.
It's not. It's apparently it's a non-executive director. It's a very senior advisor role within the DFE. But so Kevan has a very impressive CV beyond that as well. Chief Executive Officer of the Education Endowment Foundation, Chief Executive Director of Children's Services in London Borough of Tower Hamlets, but started as a primary school teacher. We don't get many male primary school teachers. I'm doing some other work on that, but it's given him a really interesting grounding in his work. Moving on down the line to Trevor Phillips. So fortunately he is the presenter of the Trevor Phillips Show on Sunday, which is lucky they named it that really. He was also chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. He's been an OBE for 26 years and a Knight for 3, which makes me wonder what I'm doing with my life. Moving on down, Professor, we'll come to you in a moment, Mercy. I'm not just missing you out on purpose. Professor Lee Elliot Major, Britain's first Professor of Social Mobility based at the University of Exeter, is a world advisor on children from different socio-economic backgrounds. We first met when he was CEO of the Sutton Trust some time ago, and has been involved in Pupil Premium and things around it, the Toolkit, etc., for many, many years since it was founded, so really interested. Came to our launch event. You might recognise Emma. Emma is a head teacher from North London, and she is one of those eyes and ears that the CSJ has out there that tell us what we should be looking at. And she spoke very thrilled that you've come back and you bring this full circle. Mercy, I didn't want to leave Mercy out. So Mercy is going to give you a bit of an overview of her research on the Pupil Premium in a moment, but I want to say an enormous thank you to Mercy as well. This has been a year-long piece of research, and it's not one of those easy pieces of research where you talk to a few people and get ideas. It's been ploughing through data sets as well as talking through people. It has been looking at really complicated factors around what makes children thrive. That's not a not a straightforward thing. It's complicated and it's emotional. A lot of us are children, we have children, and we are looking deeply into what are the things that help them get on in life. So a big thank you and a hand to Mercy for her work here. On which we're going to start, before going to the panel, with Mercy, talking a bit about her work.
Thank you for everybody for
coming here today for this launch of the Pupil Premium report. I'm sure you've all read every single page. It was published yesterday. So over the last 9 months, we've been undertaking this project to understand the impact of what arguably is the most significant education policy in a generation, which is the Pupil Premium. And its goal was to raise the attainment of disadvantaged pupils. And this project was born out of a few different conversations. The first of which was with teachers, and we're really pleased to have Emma with us here today. I'm not sure I'll find anybody who'll disagree with me, but teachers, I think, are the most important professions in our country. Our children spend 6 to 8 hours every single day, 5 days a week, 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 39 weeks a year, got there eventually. And at the Centre for Social Justice, all our research points to one conclusion, which is that without a strong start in life, your childhood years really do dictate everything you're going to do. And without that strong start in life, your life is far more likely to be marked by crime, poor health, poverty, poor outcomes all round. Now, your childhood years and the quality of education you have really are the root causes of what happens to you. And yet, for some reason, we don't take it seriously enough. And along with parents, teachers face the enormous challenge of preventing these challenges that children face and preventing the disadvantages pupils face. Along with parents, teachers have to prevent young children, pupils, of falling victim to these worst outcomes in life, and teachers are often operating in the most difficult circumstances. Now, our work at the CSJ has also been shaped by conversations with grassroots charities, and here at the CSJ we have an alliance of over 800 grassroots charities, and they feed directly into our policy efforts. These charities serve as the eyes and ears, offering insights into the daily struggles of the families and children they support. Now, their concerns, what we were hearing from teachers, what we were hearing from charities, echoed what we heard from Paul. I know Paul's going to hate having 2 mentions tonight, but they did echo what we were hearing from Paul and our conversations with him, and he co-founded True, who have supported this work. Now, Paul, like us, like the teachers we spoke to, like the charities we spoke to, he saw that our education system was failing the least advantaged children, the least well-off children in Britain. And Paul's background, unlike any of us, is in finance, as an accountant, a banker. He's a numbers guy. And so he knows when an investment isn't quite working out right, isn't quite making sense. But above all, Paul, like myself, like many of us who've worked on this project, is a parent. And the conversations we've been having about this lack of creativity and the lack of ambition so many in politics, so many who work in this space, have for our least well-off children has really struck a chord with us, and it really did strike a chord with us when we began this project. And so we believe that there must be a better way to help disadvantaged children reach their potential. And that belief has really helped drive this project forward. And so that's why last year we turned our attention to the Pupil Premium. Now, the Pupil Premium was an initiative launched under the coalition government, if anybody remembers that. I'm seeing people who might not be old enough to actually remember the coalition government, but almost exactly 15 years ago, in July 2010, the government actually announced the introduction of this new Pupil Premium. Now, Pupil Premium was a designated pot of money specifically designed to raise the attainment of the least well-off children. And at the time, then Education Secretary Michael Gove, again, remember him, I'm hoping people remember who he was, he said schools should be engines of social mobility. They should provide the knowledge, the tools to enable young people to overcome accidents of birth and an inheritance of disadvantage in order to enjoy greater opportunities. That's what Michael Gove said at the launch of Pupil Premium in 2010. But sadly, as our report shows, 15 years on from that bold promise, accidents of birth continue to determine children's educational outcomes. And for far too many children, disadvantage remains their only inheritance. Now, our report has revealed that nearly £30 billion since Pupil Premium was launched has been allocated to mainstream schools via this Pupil Premium policy, and this was meant to close the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their better off classmates. And yet, the outcomes for these pupils remain pretty much unchanged, and in some cases, especially since the pandemic, these results have got worse and these children's prospects have actually worsened. Now, when the Pupil Premium was first introduced, the gap between the percentage of children on free school meals meeting expected standards in English and maths was 22 percentage points. And when you look at the press release that the government put out when they were announcing this policy, that's the figure they quoted. Now, today, or in the last academic year, that figure remains at 22 points. That gap remains unchanged. There has been little to no progress at all. And a child born the day the Pupil Premium was announced will begin their GCSEs this September. That's how old this policy is. It's 50 years old. And the reality is that GCSEs still present one of the key determinants in life. What you get in your GCSEs determines what you then go on to do in life, in further education, in your A-levels, which then determines your job opportunities going forward. And yet, if that child was disadvantaged on free school meals or in care, when they go on to do their GCSEs next year, the gap between them and their more advantaged peers has never been wider. And in fact, that child is now more likely than not to not achieve a standard pass in English and maths GCSEs. So a minority of children who are disadvantaged actually go on to achieve that standard pass in their maths and English GCSEs. And to make things worse, as if they're not already bad, what we know is that COVID made things worse. So the majority of mainstream schools now report worse outcomes for disadvantaged pupils than they did before the pandemic, on average. And this isn't just a general decline in performance. What this report, one of the things this report did is we looked at schools where, if you're not a disadvantaged pupil, on average your attainment is probably better than it was during compared to before the pandemic. And yet, even in these schools, which are doing well for their non-disadvantaged pupils, in half of those schools, actually for disadvantaged children, their results got worse. So what we have is a huge number of schools where actually, if you're non-disadvantaged, your outcomes are on an upward trajectory, whereas if you are disadvantaged, your outcomes are on a downward trajectory. However, it's not all doom and gloom, so there are some glimmers of hope, which in this report we highlight. One of those is that in 15% of mainstream primary schools in England, disadvantaged pupils are meeting or beating the national average standard. So this is, if you think of the national average that students across the country get, disadvantaged children in 15% of primary schools are at least getting this. It's small, but it's a glimmer of hope. And in 12% of secondary schools, this is also the case. And we can learn from these sorts of schools. You know, we know there's schools where actually disadvantaged children are absolutely thriving, but we do not learn from these schools. And another problem that we identified and others have identified before, and we go into in this report, is that the criteria that the government uses to determine who is classed as a disadvantaged child or who is not is deeply flawed. And due to loopholes and inconsistencies in the system which have developed over time, it's possible for a child in a high-income, two-parent household in a nice neighbourhood to qualify for Pupil Premium, even if their household is on £100,000 a year, while a homeless child in a single-parent household earning just £8,000 doesn't qualify for the Pupil Premium. And then there's also the geographical imbalance. A disproportionate number of these high-performing schools, where disadvantaged children do particularly well, are in London. And in fact, London alone has as many of these primary schools where disadvantaged pupils are excelling as the rest of the country north of the capital combined. And let's return to these figures. So, as I said, nearly 30 billion over the last decade and a half has been spent on Pupil Premium, and this is just in mainstream schools. So this report focused on mainstream schools. If you look at sort of alternative provision schools, pupil referral units, things are even more dire. Now, to put that into perspective, that money spent over the last decade and a half would have been enough to fund 720 million hours of one-to-one tuition for children up and down this country. And looking ahead, our analysis shows that the government is set to spend up to another £10 billion over the course of this Parliament on this same policy that has been shown not to be tackling the one thing it's set out to do, which is tackle the attainment gap. And if past trends are anything to go by, then we can expect attainment gaps to not change over the course of this Parliament. Now, at the CSJ, we believe that this is a national crisis. We know that it's an incredibly difficult issue when you talk about looking at money that schools are being given, and we know it makes teachers nervous, and we know it makes government nervous. But we think it's a national scandal that disadvantaged children are not being supported in the way that they should. And this isn't about pulling money away from children who need it. It's about asking the right question, which is how can we do this better? Now, they say insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And after 15 years of Pupil Premium, we're not just failing to see better results. In many cases, we're seeing worse results. And that's why I'm really pleased to be having this discussion, really pleased to welcome you all here and to open up this really important panel discussion. And I think the question we need to confront today is a really clear one, which is that, is it time to overhaul Pupil Premium? Can we better identify the pupils who need the most help? And how can we finally raise the attainment for the most disadvantaged pupils once and for all? That's me.
So, yeah. But there is a lot of doom and gloom in there. If only we had someone here from the Department for Education, Sir Kevan, to have a bit of a think about where we go. Let's talk a bit about this issue.
Thank you, and thanks, Mercy. This is a really opportune time to talk about this subject. So, I was just thinking as you were speaking, I started teaching in East London 43 years ago, and this subject has been with us and difficult to work on, and we've been working on it for all that time, if not before. So I just want to say something about why the premium is something which we shouldn't give up on, but we do need, and you're right, to have a really good hard look at reviewing it. It's worth, I think, remembering that, just a few more numbers, not too many, I promise you. We spend about this year we'll spend £3 billion, the premium we allocated. In average, that's about if you take a child into your school who's from a family qualifying for the pupil premium, you get about a 10% extra on the child's capitation. So the child gets an annual amount and you get 10% extra. Our overall spend, by the way, that's not all the money we spend on these children, and we continue to fail these children. We also, in the main funding formula that schools get, there's also another chunk of money for the children you teach who happen to come from low-income targeted families. So there's quite a lot of money allocated to these children. So why do we keep finding it really hard to make a difference? I think the first thing I'd point to is you need to be clear about the counterfactual. Where is the counterfactual? Well, we don't really have one, because we only have we haven't said to some schools, you know what, you're not getting premium, just so we can have a little randomised control. That didn't quite go down, but we have got other countries you can look at, especially pre-pandemic. Now, in the period pre-pandemic, we did start narrowing the gap. Nowhere near as fast as you want to, nowhere near as well as you want to. In other countries where you see this data, let's take somewhere like we were just mentioning, talk about Australia, the gap had been widening. So I'm not saying we had the answer, but I'm saying we must look at all the data in the round. And by the way, the total amount we spend on children in England is, as a percentage of GDP, kind of in the middle of the pack with other countries that you might compare us with. So we're not spending too much. I don't want to give the £3 billion back to the Treasury, thank you very much. I want to keep it in education and find better ways of spending it. So since the government was elected last year, they've had a kind of different view of this rather than the premium. They've gone down this road called the Opportunity Mission, which is saying there are a number of reasons why children seem to be falling behind from particular communities. Let's think about the very beginning of school, the best start of life, before school, big investment in early years. And some money, we've actually for the first time put a premium into early years. As people will know, we're making an offer for parents of 30 hours of free childcare from 9 months to 4 years. That will be in place in September. And putting a premium into the early years. And we're also moving a premium into FE, because it doesn't stop needing it when you're 16. You actually need it all the way through your education. It's stark though. By the end of school, this is at 16, there's a 20-month gap between the children who are on free school, the premium children, and their peers. And 40% of that gap is in place when you start school. So this is why we need the mission to work with families, not just in education. Your point about the 1 in 7 schools where children are actually achieving at the standard rate, this is our big conundrum. Why is it around in England that you've got schools serving the same children that seem to deliver the outcomes and others can't? And we've been desperately trying, and we keep trying. Lee's here, we've worked together at the EF and the Sutton Trust. It's how do you mobilise what works in one school to another? Do you just make it a standard practice, tell people what to do? That doesn't seem to work. Do you find ways of presenting the evidence? That seems really difficult. So the quest is, how do you take the reference points in England? Don't go exotic to Singapore. Stay in this country. We've got great schools in this country. We've got brilliant schools in this country, some of them. How do you make what they do and spread it to everyone else? The big example, of course, is London, where in the 80s when I started, London was definitely the worst performing bit of England. Tower Hamlets was the worst performing bit of London, and that's where I was. And after a number of years working there, over 20 odd years, it happened to be the place now where on average, and by the way, it's got the largest number of free school meal children anywhere in the country, on average its outcomes are above the national average. So I remember having a conversation with David Cameron once, and he said to me, we were outperforming Whitney. He said, what is it you do in Tower Hamlets? I said, that's not really the question. The real question is, what the hell are you doing in Whitney? But this issue of how do you teach children well, how do you do it consistently, and how do you drive up outcomes? We seem to have done a great job in parts of the country, but we haven't done it everywhere. Go to Sunderland, go to Middlesbrough. The GCSE grades, on average, for white working class children, the average GCSE grade is a 3. The average GCSE grade in Tower Hamlets for, on relative terms, children just as poor who English is an additional language is 4.2. What is it? And if you want to tackle the disadvantage issue right now, what you have to look in the eye of is the white work. By far and away, the large group of children who are disadvantaged are the white working class as a group, 18% of the total population, and we won't move this issue until we move that group. So you need to get a bit more precise than just the general concept of disadvantage. You need to go under the hood and look at particular communities. They're not the only ones. Roma traveller children actually perform the worst of all, but we have to get into the detail. How can we do it with some and not others? Variation is our great challenge. And just a couple of things to finish with. When the programme started, I remember Nick Clegg, who really launched this actually. I mean, you mentioned Michael Gove, but I think the credit, if you like, to make this a thing should go to Nick Clegg. The idea was, if you give schools a bit more money, will it encourage them to recruit the harder to teach, the disadvantaged children into their school? Is it enough that they'll move those children and distribute children more evenly across England's system? I have to say, Simon Burgess did the research. There's been no disruption to the distribution at all, because people are reluctant, if you like, to want to move out of teaching the easier to teach children. So that I'm left with 3 things when I look at this policy. I'm left with, how do we actually work out better ways of moving what works in those 1 in 7 schools to others? 1 in 7 to me isn't a hopeless prospect. It gives me hope, you can do it. Why can't we do it in more places? The second is, how do you look harder about what works? You've got people like Chris Paston here from the EEF trying to build that evidence. Let's start from what we know. How do you actually bring that to more teachers in their practice? And the third is, how do you bring back the promise of education to those communities who seem, where I grew up, who seem to have lost that belief in the promise of education in those communities, particularly in the north. Pleased to announce, it is timely, we have already announced we're going to do a big review of Pupil Premium. We're going to link it into our review of the NFF as well, the National Funding Formula for Schools. And of course it links to our whole great big piece of work on the special educational needs. Because when you look at special educational needs, you look at absence, 1 in 20 children still missing a month a year of school because they're not there. When you look at FSM, free school meals, these things all overlap to a community, a large community of children who just haven't got access to the promise of education. And that's the challenge. And I don't think it's about giving up on the Pupil Premium. I think it's about going deeper and trying to really work out what works and move it around. Thank you very much.
Before I come to the former chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I might just ask you before he speaks, talk a little bit different communities. You're saying doing two different, you said there was a 3 and 4.2, depending whether you're in London or you're in the North East and different things. And you said we need to understand that. Do you have a direction? Do you have any sort of thoughts on where you would take that? What are those differences? What's going on there?
I think one of the success stories in parts of London where we made the difference was, I don't think we're any better than the teachers who are working hard in Sunderland. I think what happens is you align the system more with the grain of the community you serve. I remember we did lots of work with people like in Tower Hamlets. I'm just using that as an example. I could use others like Hackney. We worked a lot with the East London Mosque. We did a lot with families about the issues that aligned with their ambitions, their needs for the children. Got very close to our communities. And I think there's something about the way that we need to build a respectful, trustful relationship with some of the communities that it's quite easy to not hold that view of. So when you start talking all the time about parents constantly not turning up or being hostile to teachers, or it becomes a kind of adversarial, we've got to get away from that and get into a deeper kind of engagement and respect mutually for our communities and their communities for their schools. It has to be a partnership. So there's a big piece of work on re-engaging with families for me in that agenda. But we also need to think about the curriculum, and we're doing a big piece of work on the curriculum. How do you make the curriculum for a child who is perhaps at year 8, year 9, bored at school, voting with their feet and not turning up? How do you make it an engaging experience so they actually want to be there and they're doing things that they see really matter and linked to work? Because the other issue, of course, is 1 in 8 children, in England, young people in England, 18 to 24, aren't in employment or training. So what are they doing? It's a good question. We need to find ways for young people to get to work. And I think that the pathway from school to work, so we've done a whole piece of, I won't go on, whole piece of work on apprenticeships, massive investment in post-16, areas that have been neglected for too long, I think the Cinderella bit of our education system, and trying to make that pathway meaningful, purposeful, so people see a flight path from school, promise, into work and into potentially the mobility that brings.
Brilliant. I'm just going to give a quick advert for CSJ here that we're going to be launching some work straight after recess on that engagement with families piece, so we need to come into that. So Trevor, I want to come on to you now. 3 minutes. Good luck.
Good luck. What's going to happen now? First of all, thank you very much for including me in the panel. All these people are experts in schools. I know nothing very much about schools, since I haven't been in one for any length of time for, let's not discuss how long, but most people in this room weren't born when I was last at school. I do remember, in fact, where this started, and it was indeed Nick Clegg who wanted to reinvent the Lib Dems penny on the tax, on income tax in a creative way, and he talked to me about it, and we all thought at the time that it was a great proposition, and I actually still think it is an important proposition for a series of reasons I'll go on to say in a minute. But at that time I think it was 2 billion, now it's climbed to 3 billion. There were various things which I think we questioned about it, and the same questions that everybody asks. Is FSM really a good measure? by which you should decide how to distribute funds. It clearly isn't. We haven't come up with one that's better, but it's inadequate in all sorts of ways. Questions like, if we think about individual pupils, when we think about schools, there are all sorts of mediating factors. For example, cohort effect. You know, some cohorts or some kind of pupils will make the individual pupil behave in a different way, attain at different levels, and so on. But all of that said, I think in the end it was the right thing to try. I think that there were some problems that we now know that we did not know at the time, or didn't understand at the time, that I think lead to my wanting to support very much what Mercy has proposed, which is essentially a rethinking of the proposition. Not to abandon it, not to say this has failed or anything of that kind, but do we really understand what we were trying to do? Thing one, did we overestimate school effect? Did we really understand to what extent schools in and of themselves can make a difference? I think we probably did. And interestingly, the point you've just made, Kevan, about London, it's hard to make sense. And the sacred Simon Burgess, who's before whose numbers I will always bow, did a nice piece of work about this some years ago, in which he demonstrated, it's not causation, but you could demonstrate that you could correlate the entire improvement of over 20 years in the London region. You could correlate that to the change in the composition, particularly the ethnic composition of the student body. And your point about Bangladesh, Tower Hamlets, more or less the same thing, is exactly the point here. Actually, if you look at the attainment levels of that community, Tower Hamlets, it's hard to imagine that those two things aren't correlating. The other aspect of it which strikes me about the extent to which we expected doing things with and in schools would be the driver for dramatic change in this area was, and that is something we couldn't foresee, is the extent to which modes and channels and opportunities for learning have been transformed. Today, by a distance, and I mean by a multiple, not by an arithmetic distance, the biggest tool for learning, it's not school or university, it is YouTube in the world. It is the single most used tool, and that's by a multiple. The question in my mind now is not that schools don't matter, but do they matter in the same way as we thought they did? The second thing which I think we might have learnt, and I'll be much briefer about this, is what the premium is meant to do something in terms of success. Now, in the report, Mercy, you focus a lot on the attainment gap, but actually what I think most people also want to think about is, and you make this point, that the gap in and of itself matters, but what matters actually is what is absolute attainment. I mean, it doesn't matter if everybody, you know, if the gap is 30%, but everybody's below the threshold, who cares? The question is, can we are we raising average attainment? And the question that arises there is, what causes relative underachievement, or relative underachievement relative to some absolute standard? And what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve some notion of academic excellence? Are we trying to achieve, as people talk about a lot these days, good mental health? Are we trying to achieve resilience in children? I think that there's a need for rethinking about that. And why does that matter? Well, I went to a very particular kind of school in what used to be a British colony, and it was not fee-paying, but it was to some extent modelled on the English public school system. And the one specific thing that I think was spectacularly important about that school, boys' school, was that its culture was such that everybody was held to be potentially successful at something. Some boys great at Latin, some boys were terrific at cricket, Some boys were fantastic at fixing your motorbike. But everybody, the whole way that we constructed school, and I talk about the stigmas of that, the whole way that the school's traditions were constructed, everybody had the opportunity to shine. And that's quite a different notion than the way we think about achievement and attainment now. The last thing I want to say is something about, and that if we're thinking about rethinking the Pupil Premium, I think we need to think about attaching funding to a different idea of what success and attainment might look like. The last thing I want to say is something about diagnosis, really, the key variable. And coming back to the point I made about London and ethnic groups and so on, different kinds of people want different things. You know, middle-class families talk about having their children being rounded, personalities and so on. And they can do that because they know their children are going to do pretty well on the classical measures anyway. Some kinds of families are going to talk about their children being safe, and that's the most important thing, that they come home at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter if they can read and write, but as long as they're not dead, that's quite a good, that's a result. Many immigrant families are obsessed with security. And I think we just need to think a bit harder, again, about what we're trying to deliver. And in this context, I thought one of the points you make in the report, Mercy, which is essentially about time, is very, very important. There is a tendency for us to think about measures and indicators which lock at a certain point, key stage 2, key stage 4 specifically now, and so on. Well, sometimes success takes some time to deliver, or sometimes it comes much earlier for some people. You know, I finished school 2 years early, and that should have marked me out for a golden career. You can see it didn't happen. But so the point is, should we be thinking, and all of this to me adds up to a question. There's a case for asymmetric funding of learning, but should it be attached to schools? And should it be measured by attainment at a particular point, or are there different ways of doing this? And because I think the last point I really want to make is that simply trying to improve a proposition which I think was probably right at its time, but we might need to think again about now, might lead us down the different road. I mean, I could, for example, I'm just thinking about this as Kevan was speaking, if I really wanted to make a difference in Gateshead, I would probably not bother the Pupil Premium. I would think about, because I know, and Simon's work has done this as well, it's a different study, really interesting. If you put academically successful Hindu-Asian student in a class, the kids who are sitting around him or her, it's positive effect. What I do is I take the money and I pay families in Harrow, Hindu-Asian families in Harrow, a lot of money to move to Gateshead because I suspect that you'd have quite a big impact on what's happening there. There's another problem.
Thank you. I'm in danger of losing my role as timekeeper, so I'm
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It was a tight 3 minutes. Professor.
I'll be 3 minutes.
We'll see.
Trevor, you've done a good job of not being an education expert, by the way, because I agree with a lot of you saying. I promise, Kevin, I'll try and have some provocations and challenges. I'm finding it hard, I have to say, because I am agreeing a lot with my fellow speakers here. One thing I would say to you all is that Pupil Premium was an amazing thing. It's hard to imagine now that those days before it happened, and of course I was a bit a part of this, very proud to be part of that, and the idea of using evidence to inform that spend was a world first, wasn't it? And look at Chris here as well, and I think we probably still are a world leader in that. So I do think we have to be careful with denigrating something that actually, in my view, was a world leading thing. Now, Mercy, I agree with a lot of what you said, but Kevan mentioned it, counterfactuals. We do not know how wide those gaps would have been if it had not been for with a pupil premium and EF, etc. I know ministers advise that, Kev, you probably struggle with this all the time, right? But it's hard, but there is the counterfactual, right? And I think country comparisons is a good one. I give talks in Norway, right, which is one of the most equal societies in the world. I will tell them about all the amazing practice that goes on in this country. It's because they live in a more equitable, equal world that we struggle with, because we have such stark inequalities outside the school gates. So a child's prospects in life are, and as you know, Simon Burge, others have looked at it, but a lot of it is shaped by outside school factors. Now, I don't think that should lead us to sort of despair that schools can't make this, because I think you're absolutely right, some schools do make that difference. I think probably what they're trying to do, or what they are doing, is doing the community family piece as well as the really good classroom teacher. I suspect it's a bit of both. And I know EF are probably going to be thinking about this, but what I'm finding in the sector is there's a huge variation in practice in terms of community family work, and I think we need a bit more discipline around the evidence of what works. But basically schools are essentially becoming community centres, community hubs across the country. So I think more discipline and evidence around that would be good. I also think we need to think about poverty and disadvantage in this country outside of schools, and I know the government is thinking about this. When you look as a social mobility professional, by the way, when anyone says I'm the leading thinker in this field, my 20-year-old daughter now says, Dad, that's because you're the only professor of social mobility. But when you look at the long-term trends, they're really interesting. What we're finding is that wealth, housing, is having now a much bigger impact on children's prospects over generations. And I mean, I think we need to look at FSM as an indicator for many reasons, but I would argue that things like whether you come from an owned house or a mortgaged house compared to rented accommodation, which by the way is affecting teachers now, is become a really big thing. Since 15 years ago we set up the group. So I think when we think about disadvantage, we need to think about it in a multi-dimensional way. Trevor, you said some really interesting things about culture, right? And I also think there are cultural barriers to learning. And again, you've got to get the balance right, and I've been really slagged off in the Times for saying these things, right? But we have to understand that many children come to schools with different cultures, right? They're just as valued and valuable, but often they don't know the explicit rules of the classroom. They don't know how to advocate for themselves, put up their hand for the teacher, talk to the teacher afterwards. They might not know the language we use in schools. So I think there's a really big job for us to also think about, and I'm sorry, I'm landing lots of responsibility on the Pupil Premium here, in terms of being much more explicit about some of the cultural norms of the classroom, but also at the same time, this is where I get in trouble with the right-wing press, is valuing some of the cultures that we have in our working class communities. So I suspect some of the issues in Sunderland is that people feel very alienated by the system we have. Now, this is not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater and not diminishing standards, but I do think we need to work harder at genuinely making our classrooms inclusive. I'm trying to think of some more provocations here, Chair. I've got it. So the other thing I'd say is I think the problem that has happened with PP, and I'm using that from DS as other things that schools use, is that we fall into a bit of deficit labelling mode. I'm sure you have, but and that is the idea that once you start labelling children with a very simple label, you unconsciously start to underrate. There's lots of evidence around this. So I just think it varies from school to school, and some schools are very nuanced by this, but I think in some instances there is a bit of deficit mindset sort of creeping in, i.e. that we underrate some of those children because of the label they have. So I say I've gone academic here, right? I would use the term children from disadvantaged backgrounds more than, I cringe when we use that term disadvantaged pupils, because I think we are implicitly, unconsciously defining them by their disadvantage. And we are implying that there's a false dichotomy between disadvantage and actually, as you were saying, there was a spectrum, isn't there? So listen, I don't want to become the word police of disadvantage, but I do think we need to think about some of the assumptions we make in the language. Final point I make on this, I think we want smarter accountability, and I'm coming in to see the EF about this, and some of their views on this as well. We developed an equity scorecard, it's one resource out there, but I think we need to treat teachers as professionals, and we need to have accountability around this principle, which says to them, what have you tried, what evidence have you used, what are the outcomes that you've got? At the moment it's a bit clunky. We have this sort of pupil premium sort of report card, don't we? I think we just need to work harder about thinking about, by the way, a range of outcomes as well, not just attainment. So smarter accountability, I think, is key to this. But let's please keep the pupil premium. It's about reform, because without it, I suspect the divides would have been much bigger than they are today. Thank you.
Kevan, you've got to actually deliver this as a head teacher. A lot of theory, practice. What does it look like when you sit at your desk tomorrow morning?
Where do I start? I think it's important for you to know a little bit about our school before I tell you what we do and what my view on it is. So we are a primary school in North London, in Holloway. We have children from the age of 2 because our cohort is hugely disadvantaged. I don't use the word pupil premium on purpose, and I will tell you why in a minute. So we take in 2-year-olds and nursery children as well as a normal reception to year 6. Our cohort is, if we want to use the pupil premium term, 58% pupil premium, but probably more like 80% disadvantage. The reason why those two percentages differ is because lots of our children are hugely disadvantaged but don't come under the pupil premium criteria, which is a challenge we face with pupil premium, and I am not thinking about getting rid of pupil premium in any way. That is not at all my view, but I think it needs to change. So at the moment, 1 in every 2 of our children, more than 1 in every 2 of our children is pupil premium. 60% of our children live in really poor housing situations, and someone was talking about housing earlier. The majority of our youngest learners are growing in inadequate housing. Mould, flooding, damp, no gas, no electricity. We're all living in a hotel that has no washing machine or cooking facilities. That's our reality. We have children, 62% of our children are EAL, they speak 39 different languages. And that is also a barrier for us and a disadvantage, but also a talent, which is how we see it at school. But ultimately, when you are learning and something gets measured on attainment, it is a disadvantage. 40% of our children are from refugee or asylum-seeking families. The majority of them are not pupil premium, and yet they are living in really horrid situations, and they are often don't speak English, have huge emotional regulation and social interaction issues because they have come from a war zone, or one of their parents is left in the country that they've come from, or they've come with neither of their parents. So that gives you a bit of an idea of who we are and the challenges that we face. On top of all those statistics, the reality is our school is in the middle of one of the main county lines gang recruitment lands. They recruit outside our school gates from the age of 8. Our children are faced with domestic violence, alcohol and drug abuse most days, but they get to the end of Key Stage 2 and they do really well. And they pass their SATs and they go to secondary school, and their employment records are incredible, and that's because we have an amazing team of people. So, do I think pupil premium reaches the children who need it the most? Yes, some, not all. It doesn't reach the majority of our refugee families. It doesn't meet the needs of the majority of our children who speak English as an additional language. It doesn't meet the needs of our families who are significantly poorer than pupil premium families, who are on 0 hours contracts and get no income. It doesn't meet the needs of our children who are living in very poor living conditions. It doesn't meet the needs of our young carers. It doesn't meet the needs of our children who have a sibling who has really demanding additional needs, and they are the ones who are disadvantaged. We have families who have children and one is pupil premium, the other one isn't. They live in the same house, They have the same life. They come to school with the same parent every day, but the criteria isn't the same for both. So I think there are questions we need to talk about and to answer, because it is meeting the needs of a lot of our families, but I would say not the ones that need it the most. How can we make sure that there's a balance between accountability and autonomy in schools? At the moment, all head teachers in the UK are panicking about the fact that they have no income and no funding. So this big chunk of pupil premium then comes in, and everyone gets really excited, and it gets spent in the wrong way. So it has no impact, and that's why it has no impact, because it doesn't get spent on the right things. Now, the question is, how do we solve that? And I don't have all the answers, sorry. So to obtain the balance, we need to review the criteria and make sure that it meets the needs of all our children who, for us, are disadvantaged. I think there needs to be, we need to use the schools like ours who actually have a cohort of pupil premium pupils that are doing better than the non-pupil premium pupils. Those schools need to go out there and train other schools who probably are panicking about their budgets and don't know how to do it, and haven't thought of any innovative ways of doing it, and haven't got the time as a head teacher to do that. So use that 14% or whatever the percentage was of schools who are doing really, really well, and spread them out to other schools. Head teachers are very willing to help other head teachers, right? But we are not being used. And when there is conversations about leftover pupil premium being given to the schools that are not doing well, no. Give it to the schools that are doing well so that it spreads. It's like a smile. You smile at someone, they're going to smile back. If you give them ideas, they're going to use those ideas and use them for all those children who might not be doing well. There was talk about Ofsted being the people who assess the pupil premium criteria. Please no. As a head teacher, Ofsted is the thing you dread. Now, you don't want to put pupil premium in the same group as Ofsted. Ofsted have a long list of criteria that they have to evaluate. Financial stability isn't one of them, so why are we going to add pupil premium to that? That's about financial stability and how you use your finances to help your children. So my opinion on Ofsted is, please don't put pupil premium in the same group as that. It won't work. In terms of reforms and what we think, or what I think would make the most difference, we talked earlier about a multidimensional disadvantage matrix. I think that's really important. And it needs to include all the things that I've mentioned before, and not just look at income-based pupil premium. The income-based pupil premium threshold at the moment doesn't even match national minimum wage. So I would question that first, and then add all the other disadvantage criteria to that. If we're going to look at attainment as a measure of what makes a difference, we need to look at early years attainment, not attainment at Key Stage 2 and GCSEs. It's too late. Our children come in years ago. I've been in the school where I'm at for a long time. I won't tell you how long, but years ago there used to be a non-entry assessment where the children were either at expected, above or below. Our children come in a new category called below, because they come in with no social interaction skills, no emotional regulation, no language, very little parental engagement, not because our parents don't value education, because they do. But their experience of education isn't the same as the one that their child is getting. Therefore, they can't engage with it because they don't know what to do. So the prior attainment piece is huge. The community and parental involvement piece is also huge. We spend a big chunk of our pupil premium money on having child and family support workers. And they build the link between the children and the families. If your family, your parent, your carer, your guardian is not well, the child is never going to do well. if they don't have that emotional stability and that ability to have a conversation and to socially interact with people in school, the child is never going to be able to know how to do that. Now, taking pupil premium money away from school, in excuse my term, I think would be foolish, because we are the place where parents come in and build a relationship and build trust. Often for our parents, we are the only people they communicate with, because they have found someone in school who speaks their language or who they are not scared to make a mistake with. We are the people that can make the difference. And I'm not saying it's the same in every school, but let's teach schools that don't know how to do it, how to do that. Because once we're in and we have that whole family view of what is going on, we can then use our pupil premium money to help the family as well as the child. Because if you help the family, the child will thrive. And then to end, I think, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but having, there was talk about a data collection point for pupil premium and how to monitor that it works. As a head teacher, if you mention the word data collection to me, I think, oh my God, again? Okay. Another data collection point. We have loads, all day, every day, particularly in July. In fact, it's the wrong time to ask. I understand that there needs to be some kind of accountability, but let's make it an improvement partner, supportive process. Let's make it a conversation. We all do an analysis of our pupil premium, non-pupil premium data, because that's what we get asked to do, but we also do a disadvantage, non-disadvantage. And it looks very different to pupil premium, not pupil premium. So pupil premium is great, and it has enabled a lot of our children to succeed. But pupil premium needs to be different.
Brilliant. Absolutely losing my job as a timekeeper. So we're going to be open till 8 o'clock, so do stay and talk about that. We have got 5 minutes for a few sort of formal questions, if you have any. Raise your hand in the air. Cilla Black style, what's your name, where'd you come from, direct it to the panellists you'd like to answer it. I've got 3 along the front row here. Just before we do, Harry, do we need a mic for online, or are we all right? No mic for online. Okay, so we go 1, 2, 3, ask at once, and then we'll get the panel.
Hi, Jen Fox, Chief Exec of Action Teacher, and we have the absolute pleasure of working with him in her school for the last, I don't know how many years.
Lots.
She genuinely makes magic happen daily and routine. It's one of my favourite places to go.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that I was looking at the report seeing was the, clarity that the attainment gap hasn't closed in more recent times, obviously the pandemic, and so pleased the counterfactual point was raised. But when you look in the early days, actually, I think, so Kevan, you mentioned it was making a slow but steady way to narrow the gap. And when I think about the difference of the ecosystem and the environment then compared to now, one big thing that stands out that was highlighted in the report is the difference in school budgets and real terms ability to spend. So I guess my question to the panel, whoever wishes to take it, is can we really have a conversation about reforming pupil premium without talking about school budgets, given that we know so much of the pupil premium spend, as Emma's mentioned, is being used to plug the gaps of paying for the toilet paper, for example?
3 at once.
That was great, and at the risk, we've had a couple of Nick Clegg references, at the risk of reheating another one. I think I agree with Lee in his comeback. I think there's huge amounts of positive in this, and it's absolutely right that it needs reform. The only worry I have is a slight risk of conflating. Chris Paston from me. Slight risk of conflating some of the greatest strength of pupil premium with a weakness, which is its visibility. So there's lots of things that will contribute to the gap. We've heard lots of it here, but the one strength pupil premium has is it's a very visible spotlight on the issue, and I think getting it right, exactly describing, feels completely fundamental. But there's one recommendation in there about consolidating funding streams, and the one thing I just think we want to try and avoid losing is the idea of the spotlight and the push towards thinking about effective practice that pupil premium gives. It gives you this behavioural nudge. So the question is just in terms of that recommendation around consolidation, just sort of whether you thought about that and the idea to still keep this sort of sense of reporting or still this instinct that you go to evidence to use it. So that was the one thing I just wanted to flag.
And the third question.
Hello, thank you for your time this evening. I'm Samia. I grew up actually in Tower Hamlets, so I went to school in an academy, and I'm also a school governor and vice chair of the school board for an academy in Newham. So that school was actually one of the worst performing schools in the country. I think about 54% of our students are in receipt of the Pupil Premium, and now after it's joined the Academy Trust and went through that process, it's one of, I think, actually third in the country for students in terms of attainment that are in receipt of the Pupil Premium. So my question is personally, in my opinion, I think there is a strong correlation between academies and academisation and attainment levels for students that are in receipt of Pupil Premium. Obviously, there's been quite high level examples of where that hasn't actually gone well, and there has been issues, and academisation hasn't always been done for the right reasons. But I'll be interested to hear your views about academies and the role it has played in terms of increasing the attainment for students in receipt of the Pupil Premium.
Who wants to go first on those? Yes. Sam was fast.
Sorry. We are not an academy. We are a state school. And I find the conversations around academies very difficult. To me, a school is a unique place. It is not a business that needs a CEO. My children have names, and they will always be people, not numbers. And I think when you turn a school, and I'm very opinionated about it, so apologies. But I love my children dearly. They're not my own, the Pakeman children. And it's really important to me that every school keeps their identity and their, I don't know if uniqueness is a word, it is now. Academies have a tendency to be a cluster of schools that have the same approaches and the same ways of doing things, and personally I don't think that works. And I think that is possibly why some academy chains attainment isn't so great, because a one fit for all doesn't work. And one of the reasons why I think our results are good with the cohort of children that we have is because we think about each individual child in a very unique way.
By the way, just very quick, I totally agree with it. I think you need an explicit spotlight on it. However we define it, whatever the nuances are, I disagree with you on something else. We found something, but I absolutely think that is critical. Honestly, I think you have to have an explicit notion that there are children who face extra barriers than others, and that we hold people accountable to that.
We'll down this end. So Trevor,
Above my pay grade.
Your point about we have great academies, we have poor academies, we have great maintained schools, we have poor maintained schools. I'm completely agnostic about structures. I'm interested in great schools. I don't think there's any evidence that shows a strong correlation. In fact, when you do the distribution curve properly, it sits on top of each other, basically. So what you need are great schools, and you can call them what you like. And you need opportunities to transform schools, and what great academies have done is transform schools, and that's particularly. But isn't Emma, most of what you've said is interesting to me. It's living proof that actually the freedoms to determine how you create your school are in our system. And they are available to take advantage of. And one of the debates around this is the balance between autonomy and control. So there are some who say, look, the Pupil Premium, we should just tell people these things you can spend it on. And others are saying, and everyone would hate that, actually, I know what's best for my children. And by the way, the money isn't for although the money is allocated on a child basis, the money is for the school to spend for all children, because you rising tide lifts all ships. We don't want the money spent on the child, we want it spent on the school. To create a better environment for all children to thrive, particularly for the disadvantaged children. So I'm not as emphatic as nowhere near as Emma on most things, but certainly not on the academy's point. I think you just need great schools. I don't really care what the name above the door is.
I agree. I think it is about being a great school, but about being unique in the way you approach it.
And some of them I go to, they're really careful about every child.
I'm going to hit pause on proceedings there. The bar remains open. That's the end of the formal bit, but informally, this is our office. You're welcome to stay here, have a drink, meet people, chat to people, but I promised I would let some people leave around 7 because they turn into pumpkins. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our online audience. Huge hand for our panellists and nurses. Have a drink. Meet people around you.
Probably not a chance to read the bar, is it?